can we best center our calling? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Flourish-Meant is sponsored by Access More. Today, I have with me an amazing and beautiful woman of God, Rebecca George. She is an author, speaker, and host of the popular podcast, Radical Radiance. Her greatest joy is helping women pursue their passions in a way that builds God's kingdom. And she's here to help us with centering our calling. Welcome, Rebecca. I am so excited to talk about this with you today on Flourish-Meant.
Oh, Tina, I am so grateful to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
In this second portion of our conversation with Rebecca George, who is an author, speaker, podcast host, and she also is a creator of pathways for women to reach their purpose. We're going to get into some of those practical things that will help you begin to identify that thing that God is calling you to, that next thing. It may not be the only thing, but it's the next thing. How do we start, Rebecca, on identifying our calling and beginning to step out, take that scary first step out of the boat onto the top of the water? How do we do that?
Yeah, it feels scary to all of us, I think. So I want to start there of just demything the fact that it's ever going to feel real comfortable and cozy to take a big step of obedience. I just don't think that's ever been the case in my life. But I also think it can sometimes feel confusing or maybe, I don't know, discouraging to not feel like you have direction, right? And I've had those moments in my own calling as well. And so an exercise that I love walking people through that has been so powerful is something I like to call your calling Venn diagram. So do you remember walking through sort of a Venn diagram exercise, maybe in middle school? I kind of remember that, where we would compare and contrast different ideas, and what happened in the center of those two circles kind of is what you were looking for, right? And so this Venn diagram has three circles. The first circle is titled What Matters to You. And so I love just taking a few minutes and thinking through, where do you feel naturally gifted by God? When you're doing maybe that particular thing, you lose track of time. You love and feel just naturally wired for that particular thing. I would be willing to bet for me and you both, communicating and encouraging women would probably be in that box. I feel that, we're probably both naturally wired for that, right? So it's important to identify that, what matters to you. And then the second bubble or circle is what matters to God. And so if we look in his word and we see, okay, what matters to God that might also line up with what matters to me. And I'm going to continue using us as the example, right? God desires that his word is taught faithfully and that the gospel continues to go forth. And that also matters to me in that I'm able to use my gifts in that way, right? So I start to see that overlap a little bit. And then over on the left-hand side, the last circle is what matters to other people. And so as you look around to the world around you and the community that God's placed you within, what are some practical needs that you see that you feel, okay, yeah, my gifts and talents that God has placed on my life meet that need in a certain way, right? And so for us, it would probably be, man, there are women out there who are just in need of encouragement. And the way that God has gifted us with communication that also matters to God is able to meet that practical need in the way that you're serving your listeners right now on this podcast and on your video series. And so we're then able to kind of piece together not just this, calling that's based out of selfish ambition, but really connecting it to how God is at work in your life, in your community, and how you're using your gifts and talents for his glory.
So let's move from the people who were just starting, and they have started and they've gotten kind of partway down on this path of following the calling, and they hit. Now you're a runner, so I'm going to use runner's terms, even though I am not a runner unless something with teeth is chasing me. We can use that terminology because even in following our calling, we'll hit a wall. we'll hit a place where we just don't feel like we can go any farther. Either discouragement grabs us by the heels and yanks us down, or there's circumstances like financial circumstances that really make it look like it's impossible to move one more step. What would you say to that listener who's in that place where they've pursued what they thought God called them to do, but it's not working well? And how do I even take a step past this place where I'm just stalled out, worn out, and dropping to my knees?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would first say we will have those moments, right? Because we are human and we are finite. We have very real limits, and and like I said, we're human. And so I also just want to say that I have those moments in my own calling. So I just want to own that, right? That we all have those moments. And when we do, I think a couple things can happen. It could be an indicator that God is prompting us of, okay, maybe my capacity has changed and I can't operate at this level forever. And so I'm going to have to really sit back and consider, do I need to lay something down in order to create capacity elsewhere? Is it just a moment of endurance where I am to take some time to really discern, okay, God, you have equipped me for this work. And so therefore I want to be faithful, but help me with the wisdom and the discernment to know what that looks like moving forward. Right. And sometimes, and I mentioned this earlier, I think we have to get our foundation right. And as you teed up that question, you're making me think of a story in the book where I was running a marathon. As you mentioned, I'm a runner, and I hit the actual wall that people talk about when they run marathons. And pretty close to that very moment in that road race, and you probably remember the story, I approached this bridge coming towards the last probably 10K or so of that race. And there was a patient sitting under this bridge with her family. I was running the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital Marathon. And so it became clear that this little girl was a patient at the hospital. And she was holding this poster in her hands that said, "The same power that raised Jesus from the grave is living inside of you. You can do this." And the closer I got to her, I began to be able to read the sign. And man, I just, for the last 6.2 miles of that marathon, I just repeated that to myself over and over. The same power that raised Jesus from the grave, the Holy Spirit, is alive in you. You can do this. And it might seem like a silly example, but we walk into our calling in those moments where we're just exhausted and we fall to our knees. Sometimes that's the reminder that I need, right? There are absolutely moments when I'm striving and that needs to be dealt with. There are also moments when God is asking me to endure through something in my calling, and that requires a remembrance of the fact that I carry the very Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, inside of me as a Christ follower, and that it's not all on me or up to me to accomplish God's agenda. I get to partner with Him. Another quote from the book that comes up a lot for me is, "The outcome is His, but the obedience is ours," right? I think so many times we think it's, like I said, all on us or up to us, and the outcome is not on us, but the obedience in that next step, whatever that looks like, that's our faithful next step, right?
Yeah, because when I get stuck and I fall down and I don't feel like I can move any further, it's because I'm looking at my own feet. I'm looking at me being the center of my calling instead of centering my calling on looking out at the people that God has put in front of me. Like you said, seeing that child that was going to benefit from your ministry, knowing that out of love you could try to press forward, and then
Yes.
looking up and knowing that it's not in your own strength, that you're going to do this anyway. I also love that you talk about practical things in your book. Your book, Do the Thing, has practical pages where people can take specific steps with the questions that you laid out, the manifesto that you put in every chapter. And there are questions you can ask yourself and just really drill down deep. Do you have a favorite one that you like to get people to focus on when you're talking to them in person after a speaking event?
Oh man. I think the chapter that comes to mind, I honestly don't have the book in front of me to give you a specific question, but the chapter that comes to mind for probably the most women which are mainly the, people we're talking to after an event, would be the chapter on striving, because I think it is such a stronghold in so many of our lives. And we feel like it's all on us or up to us, and remembering our very real limits, and discerning that with the Lord, and really asking the Lord, okay, what does faithfulness look like in this season? Because it certainly doesn't feel like a heart of striving every day of my life. And so how do I run at that healthy pace, I think is just one that comes to mind as a common conversation that I'm having. And yeah, I love that you brought that up, because I just don't think this message in particular is one that we can read and just dust our hands up and sit it on our pretty bookshelf and move on. I think there's some heart work and some prayer work that we need to really walk through with the Lord to discern what it looks like for us to take those next steps in a way that's faithful, in a way that meets our season well. And so it was really important to me, and I'm thankful that my publisher included that piece, because I think the message lends itself to that, and it's needed. So I love that.
You mentioned that the outcome is up to God. So let's talk about the people who are in a ministry where they're not seeing outcomes. They're not seeing any kind of evidence of results. What would you say to somebody who's listening, who's been trying to be faithful and they just don't see the outcomes or the results? How do we turn that over to God and still believe that we're called to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I would first say we love seeing fruit, right? We, as people, we love to see, okay, A caused B, and I'm able to see the fruit of my labor, and that feels really good to us, myself included, right? I love to see results. I love to see outcomes. The reality of many of our lives is much different than that, though, right? And I mean, even for you and I, in the work that we do, I have dreamed of writing a book and becoming an author most of my adult life, right? I began walking down this path about 8 or 9 years ago. And so there were many days where I felt that tension of not feeling forward progress or wondering if it was ever going to be my turn. And so I deeply relate to this challenge. And one of the things that helps me, because for the person coming to this video or podcast episode, and they just need something real practical that might help in this instance, something that I try to incorporate in just my rhythms of life is working on projects that I can finish, right? Or taking on a hobby that I can start and finish. For instance, I took up making polymer clay jewelry in the middle of the pandemic. It is one of my favorite hobbies. It is so fun. And one of the reasons why it's so life-giving to me is because it's something I do with my hands, right? And something I heard, and this is not my quote, but if you work with your mind, it's helpful to rest with your hands and do something crafty with your hands. And so I think that's a little bit of it. I also think that being able to finish something that I start is so helpful when the work God has called me to do is really a long game, right? Like there are many days of my work that I don't see forward progress. And so if I can find something that does allow me to feel sort of that small win in a sense, it just can be life-giving when you're not getting that maybe in your day-to-day. So I don't know if that resonates, but that's something practically that's helped me.
So we need to look for a moment of feast time and celebration, like
Yeah.
put on the Hebrew calendar on purpose by God, so that we take that time with God and say, you are faithful. No matter what the circumstances were in the journey of the Israelites, they still took those feast days and celebrated God's faithfulness, even though they didn't necessarily see the promises fulfilled in those moments. Yeah. And we need to do that too. We need to celebrate who God is and his creation. I think creative work is really therapeutic when you're going through a rough time, in addition to giving you that sense of completion. I also like to do jewelry occasionally, or art or crafts, because of that very same thing. A book is never done. You're never going to get to the end of that. So you got to have some kind of small something that gets finished. But I think spending that time with God to celebrate when you have
Yeah.
something small, even a step toward your goal that is finished. That's really
Hmm.
helpful. Any final thoughts that you want to leave with listeners who are trying to center their calling or know their calling?
Yeah, I would just say it continues to be a journey, right? I think one of the most important things we have to remember is that it changes from season to season. And so you might be coming to this conversation sensing maybe a shift in the work God has called you to do. And I just want to also say that that's okay too, right? As kids come into our lives, or we get married, or we walk into a new season in motherhood, whatever, all of those changes in our family also change what our day-to-day looks like and how we are using our gifts and talents to the fullest. It shifts from season to season. So I just would probably leave people with that, of remembering that it's okay when those things shift.
This has been such a poignant and beautiful conversation with Rebecca George. I hope that all of you listening have enjoyed this. Rebecca, can you tell everyone how they can get a copy of Do the Thing and stay connected with you on the internet and social media and other places where they might hire you or get in touch with your other resources?
Sure, I would love that. So you can find me mostly on Instagram over at Rebecca George Author. You can grab the book anywhere you like to buy books, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Christian Book. And my website is radicalradiance.live. So if you're interested in just connecting with the Radical Radiance podcast, or coaching or speaking, or any of those things, it's all there. We're actually doing a series over on the podcast with a conversation that kind of is pointed back to every individual chapter of Do the Thing. And so if you dig into the book and you think, man, I just really love to hear a real pointed conversation on striving or on time management, we're going to be releasing those beginning the week after the book comes out. So I'd love to have you over there as well at Radical Radiance.
And in case people are listening to this after that release date, what is that date?
Yeah, absolutely. It's April 4th.
Okay, fantastic. I know that all of you listening were inspired by this conversation with Rebecca George. I hope that you all feel a little bit more centered in your calling. And of course, I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourishment.